I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Christopher Viney. Dr. Christopher Viney is a professor from the UC Merced School of Engineering. He's a pioneer in biomimicry and is well known for his research in spiders and hippos. So we're looking forward to hearing more from you on biomimicry, and we're very honored that you're here today.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you. I think this gentleman deserves a round of applause. It's really quite powerful to go from, I'm a parent. I see lots of kids. Often with kids it's, please tidy up your room. And here we've got kids who are tidying up the planet. This is, it's really big and really, really impressive to see. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the warm welcome. I will try to tell you a little bit about crossing some boundaries. And again, with kids, often parents say we have to set boundaries. But we also, our role is to show which boundaries are really there for no real reason, and which are artificial boundaries, and which can be very safely crossed. And one of those boundaries is the one at the frontier between what we know and what we don't know, and in the creation of knowledge. So I'll talk a little bit about crossing boundaries with science and engineering, with, of course, a view on the re-greening of our planet. I have a picture here of a famous university in the United Kingdom. Some people call it the original UC. We have UCs all over California. This is University of Cambridge, so it's a UC as well. Been around for 802 years now. It's just kind of fun being an alum of a place like that, because you get things in the mail that says, continuing, please give generously, continuing 800 years of giving. My purpose for showing this slide is because the first thing people see when they see a collegiate university like that is they see walls all over the place. And walls, compartmentalizing, in some senses, life compartmentalizing what people do. But it's really a little bit more subtle than that, because within each set of walls, there's a very interdisciplinary environment. The walls delineate the individual colleges in the university. But if you go to dinner in any one of those, or you go to lunch, or you simply sit around and talk to people, you will find it's not just mathematicians hanging out together, or scientists, or literary people, or lawyers. It's people from all these disciplines coming together to discuss and eventually solve problems that we all face. So one of my main messages today is that as you individually, and particularly for the kids, as you go out and try and have a career, and you try to figure out maybe already what you want to study in college, it's important not to dig yourself too deep a hole when you study, because knowledge is very interdisciplinary, and the solutions to problems will be found by looking over walls, crossing boundaries, talking to people outside of the field that you think you're studying. I've got to get used to the technology here. I think that's not the right clicker. Let's try this one. Anyway, so today's focus is to talk a little bit about interdisciplinarity, but where this interdisciplinarity is coming together is in the field of biomimicry. And what finer way to be green than to go to nature and see how nature itself manages to coexist with itself. One of my former students, many years ago now, once told me that nature is full of solutions, walking, crawling, flying, moving around, looking for a problem, to go and solve. In other words, nature has, of course, solved its own problems, but we, as we look at nature, we can see those solutions and apply them to problems that we have. Okay, so if we're going to talk about biomimicry, let's try and talk about what nature does particularly well. Okay, why copy nature? Why is nature itself such a good role model? Well, first of all, it's very adaptable. So nature actually works in all kinds of environments, and sometimes even rather harsh ones. And, believe it or not, if you go inside the vent of a volcano, you will find some life forms there. There are microorganisms that can survive at the bottom of the sea. There are vents, where the Earth's crust is cracked open, and hot gases and hot material from the inside of the Earth come to the seabed through these vents, and locally it boils the water. Now you figure that, you know, to boil water at the great pressure at the bottom of the sea, you might need 300 degrees centigrade to do that. And you know, if you go and look in those environments, you will find life forms. Do I need one of these?
I think we need a recording.
All right. I usually get accused of yelling too loudly at my audience. So. There will be no foolish wand waving in my class. Anyway, so life can survive even at several hundred degrees centigrade. So you will find adaptations, if you look carefully, to much harsher environments than just the everyday environments that we are used to seeing. Okay, nature recycles particularly well. And no finer example than the spider web. If you see a spider crawling along on the ceiling, here's a little experiment you can do with it. Do this carefully, don't do it with a black widow, but you know, if you see a spider crawling on the ceiling, tap it with a newspaper or the garden rake or something like that. Not directly underneath it because it'll fall on your head, but you know, over here. And then watch it come down to when it's about here, and then tickle it. You use the newspaper again, right? And you tickle the spider. Now, the spider has forgotten why it came down from the ceiling by this point, and it starts to climb back up the silk that it came down on. And you watch it really, really carefully, what you'll find, it's collecting the silk with some of its legs and rolling it into a ball, the extra silk it doesn't need anymore, and it's stuffing it into its mouth, and it's munching on the silk, and it's eating the silk. And it's also got some legs left over. It can wave at you and try and scare you off, you see, but that's why they need so many legs. But as it's climbing, you see, it's eating the silk. They do this with their webs as well. They eat yesterday's web, break it down into the amino acids that are the protein building blocks, and they produce new web about half an hour later. Those building blocks are coming out the back end of the spider as new silk. So there is extreme recycling. Nature does this very, very well. Nature uses water as a processing solvent, so many useful things happen in water, which of course is environmentally benign, much more benign than concentrated boiling sulfuric acid. Spider silk, okay, is spun from a solution in water. Kevlar, which is the thing that people who are studying spider silk, they want to try and mimic. Kevlar, synthetic fiber, which isn't as tough, you need that boiling concentrated sulfuric acid at 4 atmospheres pressure to actually do your processing. Nature works a lot of the time, although it's adapted to high temperatures, but a lot of the time it works close to room temperature, so it can teach us how to synthesize, how to make stuff without having to light really hot fires or produce really hot furnaces, consume huge amounts of resources in getting to those temperatures. Nature self-assembles. It starts with molecules and builds complicated things. What's the most complicated thing that you can think of? The most complicated, well, device or complicated anything. Think of something that does things and that's really, really complicated. Human brain, yes. Human beings. You know, and how are we built up? It's not like, you know, it's not like that, some huge amount of material is taken and you chip away the bits you don't want and you leave the human being. You start with molecules and build this complicated device up from the ground upwards, from the molecular level upwards. That's a very efficient way of building complicated machines. And the structure, you know, human being, there are cells and there are tissues and there are organs and then there's a whole body at these different levels. And nature is really good at optimizing the organization of molecules at different levels to produce complicated results. Nature is really good at using very different materials, very unlike materials, in composites, which can actually achieve new properties. And then, perhaps most important of all, nature can stimulate creativity. Now, you know, Leonardo da Vinci used to go into the marketplace in Milan and he would buy doves. And the reason they sold doves in the marketplace in Milan was so that people could eat them. But Da Vinci would go and he would buy some doves and he would let them fly. And people used to wonder, you know, no, it's not surprising that the artists are always starving if they go and buy their dinner and then they let it fly, right? But of course, what he was doing, he was thinking, well, if that animal can do that, well, so can I, if I learn the principles. You know, and that is a very fundamental principle of biomimicry. It's saying, gosh, look what nature does. I wish I could do that. And there's no creature, no plant, no microorganism which is so yucky and so horrible and so uninteresting that you can't learn something from it. So even, you know, the little bug that people step on, Don't step on it. It's probably smarter than you are at something. Learn from it, please. Okay, so let's look at a little bit of biomimicry and some examples. Biomimicry itself, actually learning from nature, has been around for a very long time. And even the ship, which you see on the left there, ships, if you look at the structure of a ship, what do you see? You see ribs and a backbone. The keel is the backbone, and you see ribs. And anthropologists believe that ships were first thought of on the sort of scale that they became when people saw beached whale carcasses and thought, well, if I can build something with a backbone and with ribs and attach stuff to it, it might float, and I might be able to put things in it and take them somewhere. And so commerce and trade developed. It turns out in England, you can probably tell from my accent that I am from England originally, though English is not my first language. Go figure. In England, after the great period of unrest several hundred years ago, the people who built ships were out of a job. So what instead, with all this unemployment, what the country did, they started producing some very impressive buildings, including New College in Oxford, late 14th century. But if you look at that roof, what do you see? Look at the roof. What does it look like? It's an upside-down ship, isn't it? And the people who build ships were put to work building roofs. Okay, and just produce an upside-down ship, same principle, works really rather well. It's entertaining to see that New College was built in the late 14th century, but at the time it was built, yes, it was new. Okay, that's how that worked. Okay, well, here's a wonderful teacher. Okay, wonderful teacher. Nature makes all kinds of useful stuff. This particular picture was published in a book by National Geographic, Frontiers of Discovery or something like that, in 1999, and they were producing a book to show off what people are able to achieve as we were heading into the new millennium. Seems so awfully long ago now, doesn't it? You know, that we were heading into the new millennium. But what they were making the point was, and I think it was a very bad point, which I'll explain why. They were saying, look at this gear wheel. Aren't we terribly clever as people? We can make little gear wheels like that. It's made out of silicon, so it's nice to be talking about that here in Silicon Valley. But this wheel, oops, wrong button. Misdialed there. Let's try that again. So this wheel, this gear wheel, it's only 1/100th of an inch across, but it's produced by micro-machining a piece of silicon. So you take a bigger piece of silicon, which takes a lot of energy to make and purify, and then you take a lot more energy to go and knock little pieces off that silicon until you get something that looks like a gear wheel. So I'm afraid I was not impressed when I saw this particular picture, because I'm thinking to myself, inside this ant, there are tiny motors and machines that move the head and move the antennae and move the legs. They're 1,000 times smaller, and they're not made by taking big pieces of stuff and whacking bits off it until you end up with a little machine. They're made by taking molecules and constructing the machine. Also, what else can we learn? Not just about tiny motors and machines, but about tiny, fast computers. And the computing power and speed of that ant, in many respects, is superior to the processing power of the laptop that I'm driving the presentation from, in terms of what they're able to do on the scale that they actually do it. So there's plenty to be learned there. Sensitive thermometers. There are, not the ant, but there are some beetles which can sense temperature at a distance. Particularly bark-boring beetles, what they can do is they can get a heat signal from a forest fire that might be 35 miles away, as much as. And so they can be flying around, they pick up this heat signal from a forest fire, and they go, aha, perfect conditions, and they fly over to that where the forest fire is, look for the trees where the bark has been burned on the trees, they lay their eggs, and the beetles that hatch from those eggs are happy to eat that burned bark. But just think about it, this bug can tell the difference between a forest fire, somebody's barbecue, somebody's house that might have caught fire, just simply the sun heating up the land, to some particular temperature. So imagine if we could build a sensor based on this principle. You could attach one per acre, in the forest, attach one to a tree, have a little transmitter built in. So instead of having somebody sitting in a fire lookout tower with a pair of binoculars and looking for smoke rising somewhere there in the distance, you could have something locally that could recognize a fire and report it before it got out of hand. Wouldn't that be nice? Okay? Special lenses. You know when you drive, now some of you are a little bit too young to do that, but you probably still have an opinion on how your parent is driving, right? Now you've hopefully noticed that as you come up, there are many, many lanes, maybe you've got a left turn and a straight through and a right turn, you only see the lens of the traffic light that is relevant to the lane that you're in. Thank goodness, otherwise here in these really wide roads, you'd have 7 different pieces of information to try and decide. You only have the one lane that you're in, the lens of which you can actually see, unless it's very windy and these things are flailing around and then it gets interesting. But that lens, which can direct light in a particular direction, is actually copied from the compound eye of insects. Now, copied, but remembering that light, of course, can travel in 2 directions. So what people realized was that if you can take a lens that can take light from particular directions and focus it, you can use the same optical system to take a light source and send the light out in particular directions. So it's sort of a reverse-engineered moth eye is how this was done. And then some of the antennae on insects can detect particular chemicals to part per billion accuracy. And if you want to know how much 1 part per billion, so there's a billion molecules and only one that you care about, and you want to spot that one amongst the billion, an antenna like that would have the sensitivity to do it. How much is 1 part per billion? Well, there are 1 billion seconds in 32 years. Okay, so part per billion, it's saying, can you spot that? I'll do it in the microphone since I was told to. There we are. Okay, can you spot that if you pay attention for a full 32 years? That's the sensitivity we're talking about. Okay, well, let's look at some biomimicry here. That's a giraffe on the left and me on the right. Please don't get them confused. Okay. The giraffe is helping itself to some rotten apple. You can have very interesting conversations in the supermarket when you do biomimicry, because I went to the supermarket to get a rotten apple so that I could feed the giraffe and get it to drool. I wanted the saliva. Okay, so long jar here. See the tongue? Okay, they have very long tongues. I wanted it to reach in, grab the apple, drool all over the inside of the jar so that I can collect the saliva and go and study it. And giraffes are actually very drooly animals. Okay. And you go to the supermarket, right, and you buy the rottenest apple you can find, and the lady sitting there at the checkout counter, she thinks, okay, bachelor, can't fend for himself, I can get you a much nicer apple, sir. No thanks, I want it for a giraffe. All right, just get out of here. Conversations you have in supermarkets when you do biomimicry. Okay, giraffes, their tongues are 18 inches long on a fully grown giraffe. They can lick their own ears. I'd quite like to be able to do that in the morning when I'm late for work. Kind of clean up in the rearview mirror, probably cause some traffic accidents if other drivers are watching. But why study this stuff? Because in our bodies, mucus is very important. Anybody ever wondered why you don't digest yourself? If you think about it. Because you are made out of edible stuff. You have the enzymes in your stomach to digest that stuff. Why don't you wake up in the morning with a hole sort of where your navel was, right, and you started to digest yourself? It's only because of mucus lining which is covering the inside of your stomach and your intestine. And that mucus lining breaks down, that is when ulcers and other nasty things start to happen. So we want to study how the stuff flows and see how we can learn from the structure of mucus that we collect from other sources to see we collect it from giraffes, I've collected it from slugs, and by studying that we can learn how we can diagnose and hopefully also work against defective mucus in digestive systems and also in respiratory systems. People who have asthma and cystic fibrosis, the mucus isn't behaving itself properly. So studying mucus, learning lessons, and ultimately learning things about biodegradable lubricants. Okay, imagine, mucus is a very good lubricant, so imagine that you have boats on pristine lakes and you have sealed bearings where the propeller comes out, the bearing is sealed. But if the bearing does break and leak the lubricant, all you get is nice biodegradable mucus, not some horrible oil going into the water. That's the sort of reason why one would study something as apparently yucky, but actually very, very useful as mucus. And here we have a young lady in my lab studying slugs and their mucus. And you can actually convey information in mucus. It's not just we can learn about lubricants and biodegradable water-based lubricants, but curious thing about slugs is if they leave a trail, another slug can read information out of that trail. It can read actually read which way the trail was laid down. Now, if you come along and look at a snail trail and you can't see the snail, how do you know which way the trail was laid down? If you come up to a single-track railway line and you look at the railway track, how can you tell which way the last train went? Okay, now another slug can do, another snail can do, it can read this sort of information out of the trail. It can also read how recently this happened, and it can even say something about a slug looking at the trail can tell whether the slug that left the trail was a boy slug or a girl slug as well. So there's a lot of information written in there. So imagine if you can write information and keep it and read it back. Well, that's a computer, isn't it? Except you're storing information at the molecular level. And we've been trying to find out how that works. Can we copy from the structure and the use of mucus in nature to make actually faster and perhaps more efficient computers in the long run? And so this is just a little bit of fun we had here. So I've been working on mucus for years, and in 2000, the Times newspaper in London got a hold of this story, and the Times prides itself on never running fake stories on April the 1st. Never ever runs fake stories, but they wanted to run this story because they thought some people might think it was fake, so they ran it on April the 1st. And we were sort of colluding with the Times newspaper there on playing a joke on the rest of the country. It was kind of fun. But the science was real, you see. Okay, another of my students working with a very large snail here, and that snail produces a lid over its opening when it gets too dry or too hot, and the snail doesn't want to dry out. It produces a lid, and that lid, it's organic stuff with inorganic crystals embedded in it, just like bone. Except if you want to study how bone develops, how long does it take a bone to develop? Well, for most of the audience, your bones are still developing. It'll take another, 10 years perhaps before they're fully developed. It takes too long if you want to do the research on a growing bone. But one of these lids forms in about an hour. Great stuff to do research on if you want to study what's called biomineralization. So, the frontiers of knowledge may be closer than you first realize. Why am I saying that now? Because the young lady in the picture was 16 when she came to work in my lab. So my encouragement to you is you're doing fantastic projects. I've been very impressed with I didn't have time to look at them all, but I looked at a few after I arrived this morning. It's really, really impressive stuff. Now, make sure that you go on and, you'll be working with your school, but you'll also be working perhaps with a local university department. And you will find that there are researchers at university who will work with you in getting to the frontier, and the frontier is actually very close. The skills that you need to get to the frontier are ones that you're learning even in elementary school, certainly in middle school, certainly in high school. Nothing happens if you don't work. So the work ethic is important, the ability to observe and say, oh, well, that's odd. I wonder why that is. You have to be organized, you have to be able to structure your research and structure your reporting, and you have to be able to communicate. And I've seen some very polished communication today already. I have been working on silk for about 20 years now, trying to learn lessons from spiders. We look at the business end of the spider, where the silk comes out. You magnify it, it looks like that. Okay, so there you go. Did anybody say yuck? They're wonderful, they're fantastic, they're interesting. Just think what you can learn from these things. All right? And you can even see one of the strands. That's the stuff that they hang from ceilings on and the stuff they build the spokes of the web. Okay, that particular silk. The reason there are so many... Whoops, wrong button. The reason there are so many of these collections of spinnerets is because the spider makes many different kinds of silk, each optimized for a particular reason. So there's a lot of processing going on at that end of the spider. This is probably the most technical slide I'm going to show today, but if you can bear with me for a minute, I think there's a huge lesson here in this slide. And that is that, now remember, stuff nature makes, it starts with molecules and builds up. Silk is a solution, when it's made by the spider, it is a solution of protein in water. It's a very concentrated solution of protein in water. And somehow it manages, when it's being spun, spider silk and also silkworm silk, when it's being spun, there's no chemical change in that protein. It's the same protein in the fiber as it was in the solution. But suddenly, this silk will no longer dissolve in water. So that's a very useful thing, isn't it? That if you can have a solution of stuff in a good, common, nice solvent, a non-toxic solvent like water, you spin the fiber now doesn't go back into solution in water again, thank goodness, otherwise my silk ties would dissolve in the rain, and that would not be good. Okay? So it doesn't dissolve, but it was processable from that solvent. No chemical change in the silk at the same time. How does that work? And we believe we found the solution in the lab a few years ago now, but it's an interesting lesson, that the molecules of the protein, they have bits which hate water, that's a bit in red, and they have bits which like water, that's a bit in blue. And so they fold, they form coils, so the water-loving bit is on the outside and the water-hating bit is hiding inside from the water. These coils stick together into what's called a liquid crystalline structure, and that means, although it's a very concentrated solution, the viscosity comes crashing down, and this tiny spider with few muscles can push this very concentrated solution through a tiny little hole. So it becomes processable by how these molecules organize. Then, because they're being sheared through a hole, they get stretched out, and the water-hating bits are suddenly exposed to water, and they don't like this, so they grab onto other water-hating bits from neighboring molecules, and they build crystals, which themselves can no longer go back into solution into water. So we have a blueprint here for processing from very environmentally benign conditions, things that will not redissolve under those conditions. So, it's an example of what we can learn for engineering and industry by doing some careful biomimicry. And the words are less important than what I've just said about the picture, so I'll move right along. As we continue to look at spiders, there are many other things we can learn. This is it's a tiny little spider, actually, that I photographed in my yard. Do you see those silver boxes with the round black dot on them? Do you know what those are? Well, the eye is that whole big thing there. 1, 2, 3. There's a fourth one there, but it's saluting me, so you can't see the eye. And then on top there, so 4, and there's 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so there are the 8 eyes. 4 eyes on top of the head, so it can see predators, if a bird coming in to catch it and take evasive action. But inside the eye here, what is that silver box with the black dot on it? It's a reflection of my camera on the retina of the spider. You see the camera now? Okay, and what spiders do is they don't move the eyeball, they move the retina, which is an interesting lesson for optically imaging systems, because, why move the lens, which is the difficult thing to set up? Why not just move the detector? Okay, it's actually simpler and easier. And so we can learn a little bit about optical system design. We can learn about how to make lasting colors. You see those pretty peacock tail feather colors? Look like fish scale, perhaps that very vibrant turquoise and green and blue. That's because of the structure of those mouth parts. There's no pigment there. There's no dye. There's no color. This color can never fade because it's a result of the structure of the material, not a result of the ingredients in the material. So we can learn about how to make very bright, vibrant, lasting sources of color by studying these sorts of mouth parts. And the spider can also use the hairs on its body to detect motion. So if you want to catch the spider, you don't move quickly, because the shock wave just from your hand moving towards it, a shock wave of moving air, will be detected by the spider, and it realizes that you're coming. Of course, now the fact that my camera is so accurately reflected, that spider was staring right at me. And about 2 seconds after I took the photograph, the spider disappeared. And where do you think it was? It was actually, by this point, stuck to the front of my camera trying to bite it. Okay, other things that bite. Okay, so I will apologize for, I'm going to have to sort of lower the tone here just for a moment. But hippos, very interesting animals, they can teach us about sunscreen and sunblock, which is why I've been studying their skin secretion. Because what do hippos do? They live in in the wild, in the pool all day, in the sun all day. They can grow to be 50 years old. They don't get skin cancer. They don't get sunburn. There must be something really powerful in the environment there to protect them. It is their own skin secretion. A little goes a long way. I've been trying to study that secretion and learn something from it. But why I say I'm going to lower the tone here is because it's not just protection against the sun, but hippos, in their social interactions, when they show respect to each other, they poo on each other. Okay? Do not try this at home. Do not go home to little brother or little sister and say, I want to show you some respect. You know, this is, well, you can say that, but do it the human way, not the hippo way, please. When they don't get respect, they get angry and they start fighting. Okay, now this hippo here, the one with the wide open mouth, is angry because it was not shown respect. This one looking, I mean, I don't know if a hippo can look sheepish, but probably looks hippo-ish. But you know what I mean? It's sort of like, uh-oh, I've done something wrong here. It's got that look on its face because it did not show respect. Now, they fight. Okay, they tear pretty good holes in each other. These tusks can be, these ones are kind of worn down, but those tusks can be a foot long. Okay? And now, if you are having big holes torn in you while you're fighting in very pooey water, you're liable to get infection, right? And yet, hippos do not die of infection from their wounds. And so, there is thought also to be in the hippo secretion a very powerful antibiotic. Okay? Also, now, if you happen to be covered in poo on a hot day, what else are you going to be covered in? Flies, absolutely flies, everywhere. Now, the fact is, I'm standing in Africa. I took that photograph in Zambia a few years ago now, about 4 years ago, I think. But I'm standing there. I'm not covered in poo, but man, am I covered in flies. So there's an insect repellent built into the stuff as well, you see. So personal care skin products, sunscreen, sunblock, antiseptic, insect repellent, all built into one. What more could you want when you're sitting in the jacuzzi and trying to keep away the mosquitoes and the sun and anything else that you might not want to catch? So we had some fun with hippos. And another example here of the student there, the young lady over here, she was 14 years old in high school, a sophomore in high school, when she came to help me in the lab with this Hippo project. So my point being that the frontier is closer than you think, again, please get that message. Some of you may be wondering how you get a hippo to pose for a picture like that. If you ever want to get a hippo to pose, bring a cabbage, stand within 3-point range, and make like you're going to throw the cabbage at the hippo. It'll get ready for you and pose like that. That's how you get pictures like that. Turned out that, and this is for those of you who are thinking about careers in science and engineering, or maybe you have friends who are kind of teetering on the brink of taking a career in that kind of area. Science and engineering is not stuck in the lab all day, not talking to people, wearing a lab coat, too many color pens in your pocket. That image is completely wrong. Engineers and scientists, they're sociable, they travel, they like to try other people's cultures, eat their food. We do have a lot of fun. And this engineering professor actually got taken by National Geographic to Zambia for 2 weeks to make a documentary about hippos, because they heard about the sort of research that I was doing. And some pictures from the show here. Dangerous encounters with Brady Barr. He usually goes around chasing crocodiles, but he wanted to chase a hippo on this particular occasion. My point being that and the high school student didn't come along to Zambia, but she was acknowledged in the video because she made a contribution that helped this whole thing to happen. There we are. That's Amber. She helped me put that microscope together. It came in 200 different pieces. Well, she did well. Okay, the frontiers of knowledge may be closer than you first realize. And her skill set was exactly right. She worked hard, she kept her eyes open, she was organized, she could communicate. Now there's an odd trophy. Okay, it's a wasp, which has been gold-plated so that we can put it into an electron microscope without getting it too charged up. Okay, so it's been sputter-coated with gold. one of my students on the top right there. There's at least one member of the audience who will probably recognize the student. And some of the results that we were getting from studying the petiole of the wasp. Okay, the petiole, what's the petiole? It's the waist, okay, that little tube there. Okay, and just showing you how ideas can happen. I was teaching the first physics course at UC Merced when we first opened. It was October. We're teaching it in the library because the classroom building's not ready yet. It's October. It's hot in there. You know, the window's open. I'm talking about something that's probably not that necessarily that interesting, but, you know, you have to get through all the detail in physics sometimes. There's a bang at the back of the room. You know, boom! And I honestly thought that somebody had fallen asleep and hit their head on the desk really hard. At the end of the lecture, students come along, a little cluster of students, and they've got a wasp, a rather dead wasp, and the bang was them hitting the wasp with the textbook, which weighs 10 pounds, and therefore the wasp was no longer moving. And they brought this wasp to me, and they said, "We heard you work on weird things," is what they actually said. "Would this be of any use to you?" And I corrected them. I do not work on weird things. I work on interesting things. But when we got that out of the way, I looked at the wasp. I thought, well, maybe there's something useful here. And you realize that tube is probably the weakest point in the design of the wasp, because every life function has to pass through that tube. The digestive system goes through there, the respiratory system goes through there, the secretory and excretory systems go through there, you know, and everything has to channel through that little tube. So it had better be resistant to being broken easily. Okay, so yeah, maybe we can learn something about this. And so I got a project going, and we started looking at it, and project actually worked fairly well. And what we learned about was the structure of that petiole, or the wasp. If you take a cross section, it's kind of like layered cardboard. And if you cut through cardboard, you see different layers. Except instead of seeing corrugations, we now see little spirals everywhere. So you see these are the layers of the corrugation. There's a layer, and inside you've got this spiral stuff, not just ridged, but spiral. And that's kind of useful because, let's not worry too much about the words here, but the spiral, which lives where the corrugations are, normally in corrugated cardboard you can make stacks of it, but it always bends really easily in one direction. If you put those spirals in, it won't bend easily in any direction. So it's a very efficient way of putting reinforcing material into something that has a cardboard-like structure. And, you know, if I was the sort of person to patent things, I'd much rather teach people about things than run out and patent them. But, you know, here would be a way to make a lighter, stronger cardboard box. You know, maybe FedEx would be interested eventually. I don't know. Okay, so I've talked you through that already, so there's no reason to read the long words. And then even the smallest, yuckiest thing can actually teach us something useful. So there is a fly. We have lots of dairies in Merced County, so we have lots of flies. Let's look at the end of the foot of the fly. Looks like that. How big is that? Well, we better put a scale bar in. Let's keep zooming in. We'll take that little bit there and blow it up a little bit. Looks like that. We can keep going. We put a box around that part and we blow it up and it looks like that. So what you see is that flies on a very small scale have exceedingly hairy feet. They're just like hobbits, if you've been paying attention to Lord of the Rings. Now, why are hairy feet useful? Because if you think about normal surfaces, if I put a cup down on this table here, there are probably only 3 points of contact between the cup and the table. If I've got hairy surfaces like that, all those individual hairs, each can have a point of contact with the surface. And so you've multiplied thousands and thousands of times the points of contact. And so even for those of you who know a little bit about chemistry, the van der Waals bonds, which individually are weak, you get rather a lot of them when you've got a hairy contact point. And so the bonding can actually become very strong, and that's how the fly is able to stick to just about anything. Okay? And so fly feet can teach us not just about how hobbits function, but also they can teach us about better sticky notes. And geckos do the same sort of thing. Geckos have very hairy feet. I haven't looked at those feet, but other people have been studying them for a while. And I saw at a conference a couple of years ago now, people had gecko foot material, and it was like a clamp with a handle on it. It looked like a big pad with a handle, but it was a hairy, sort of fuzzy on a very small scale kind of pad. And at the conference, they were giving us 2 of these. I've got to put the microphone down now, I'm sorry. So I will talk louder. I need both my hands here, you see. So they give you a handle with a pad on it, another one, and we were able to start climbing the wall. You see? So for those of you, if you feel like you've been driven up the wall, you can actually go and do that and demonstrate that you've been driven up the wall. It's rather bad news for those of us who think we can keep the burglars out of our yard by building a high fence. But, of course, nature has a solution to that too. I don't mean keeping a large dog in the yard. There are more subtle solutions than that. Okay. The pitcher plant. These are carnivorous plants, and a fly that sits on the inside wall here, if a fly falls in here, it can never climb out, because not even a fly foot can stick to that stuff. So you paint your wall, your high fence here, with this kind of stuff, and the burglar can't climb in anymore. Easily done. I hope at least some of you are thinking, well, if it's so non-sticky, how come it sticks to the wall? Okay, it's a question I sometimes ask students to see how much of my science they understand. I say, non-stick frying pans, how does that non-stick layer stick to the pan? Okay, but you see, nature can show us that it is possible. Okay, if you want to know the answer to that question, ask me afterwards, but you'll have to think about it first. I won't tell you directly. I'm going to tease it out of you sort of more gradually. Okay, so getting near the end here, bio-inspired self-assembly is now a favored route to nanomaterials and nanostructure. So nanotechnology, and biology has been doing nanotechnology for far longer than we have. Okay, in fact, nature's little things have been around for a very long time. So, what can we learn? There are limits to what we can do by taking a process and scaling it down. You want to make little things, making a smaller scale process isn't the best way to go. Molecules can be pre-programmed to assemble reliably into materials and structures with properties that you might want. Happens in many, many biological situations. For example, the cornea of your eye and a tendon or ligament between muscle and bone or between bone and bone, they're made out of collagen, almost identical collagen, but the subtle difference in those molecules affects how those collagens assemble into very, very different structures. Self-assembly is not energy intensive. It can be done in benign environments, so that is really the processing of the future. And the nice thing is, if you can build things up molecule by molecule, there's usually a way to undo the process, and so you've got some controllable biodegradability in there. I told you about the spider silk, didn't I? And how it's biodegradable. It doesn't just disappear by itself. It's biodegradable given the right kinds of enzymes. If you don't clean your house, those cobwebs do not disappear by themselves. Some notable successes then, what has worked well? Bio-inspired technologies, well, the whole aircraft industry. It's a big one. Back to the days of Da Vinci. The synthetic polymer fiber industry, the fact that we make textile fibers artificially, it's people trying to copy what silkworms did. The silkworm was the inspiration. Robert Hooke, very, very famous individual, right? He was trying to study silkworms, and of course now he thought, because leaves went in, he actually thought that silk was cellulose. He didn't realize it was a protein. So people, if you look at the textile industry, it was really in the 19th century very heavily based on cellulose-type technologies before people now in the 20th and 21st centuries discovered protein-based technologies. Velcro, copied from nature. Some seeds from plants, the seeds have hooks, got stuck in the fleece of a sheep. Okay, somebody noticed that in Switzerland, invented Velcro. Shark skin analogues to reduce drag. Shark skin's got just the right kind of ripples, roughness on it. There are Speedos, things you wear for swimming, that actually are based on shark skins. You can make sneakers, trainers, shoes, these things, right, which are not so smelly because they've got pores in them based on the pores that plants have for losing moisture. You can get car tires that have a very good grip in wet weather based on the foot of a frog. Tree frogs which have slimy, wet feet, and yet they can climb, they can get traction. Okay, ceramic nanoparticles, if you want to make very, very small nanoparticles of ceramics to be able to then fuse them into very strong blocks of ceramic. How to do that has been learned from what are called magnetotactic bacteria. I will show you a slide of that. And then nanocomposite coatings have been learned from seashells. Marine adhesives, how do you get something that sets underwater? Well, you learn from barnacle glue. And then smart fabrics, the idea that you can make a material which is soft when you want it to be and then hard when you want it to be. Imagine a car seat. You sit down in a car seat, it's soft, you kind of wiggle your rear end, you get yourself comfortable. Now you like how the car seat feels. You press a button, the car seat suddenly becomes rigid and holds that shape until you get tired of it. So you can be like the cat trampling the lap into the shape you want. Okay? What does that? Sea cucumbers have that kind of property. People are learning from it. Okay, so two quick examples here, two further quick examples. If you want to make very, very fine powder of ceramic, the traditional way is to take the rock, take the ceramic, put it in with great big steel balls, put it in a big tumbler, rotate the tumbler, make an enormous amount of noise, use an enormous amount of energy, make an enormous amount of mess, and you don't even get nanoparticles, you only get microparticles. It's not a great way to do nanotechnology. Instead, what you do is you can learn from there are bacteria that make little magnetic particles, and they navigate with them. I'm not making this up. There are actually bacteria that navigate with magnetic particles. How do they make them? Well, they produce using effectively something that's soap-like. So these are surfactant molecules here on the right. They take the inside of the cell, they break it up into these vesicles, they do some chemistry in the vesicle, the size of the vesicle dictates the size of the particle that is precipitated. Okay, so some chemistry, you get this done at low energy, not much environmental impact, you really make nanoparticles and they're all the same size. And you can then take those and heat them up and weld them into something like the engine block for a car. So you see, there are car manufacturing companies in Detroit who hire microbiologists to learn these sorts of lessons to make the new generation car engines. Remember I said it's all about interdisciplinary, jumping around between subjects. And then abalone shell. Okay, the shell of the abalone, it's protein and calcium carbonate, two very, very different materials, but they coexist. Now, anybody ever tried to repair a bathtub? And the caulking around the bathtub. It says on the tube, guaranteed for 50 years, and you're lucky if you can get it to stick until next week. Right? You've got this rubbery stuff, this polymer stuff, and you've got this hard tile, and they don't really like each other. The seashell is precisely that. It's the rubbery stuff, the protein, and the hard calcium carbonate, and they stuck to each other really, really well. Have you tried to break a seashell? Not easy. Very, very tough. So, nature is designing really good composite materials here. No easy way for cracks to get through them. Now, it's very, very important, as you do your research, to try and find ways of publishing it. Okay, some wonderful projects here. If you're working with somebody in a university, try to publish your research. And there are journals not just for, new research in quantum mechanics. There are journals for working, actually for outreach, journals for school-type projects, and journals for teachers to read about how to design projects. So make sure that you publish well. The example that I'm just using here of a publication, these are all pictures of hippopotamus sweat on the right there. You find when you publish that you really are crossing boundaries. Because in science, you might have a professor who's older and more experienced, and a young scientist who's just starting, but they're both equally important. That's important to realize, that how old you are or how established you are or how many papers you have published doesn't matter. It's the fact that you're doing these things together. So there's a lack of boundaries in this area. Okay, so publishing in science, you're crossing boundaries again. And it was rather nice for us at UC Merced to publish our Hippo research in a journal that's been around since before Isaac Newton was publishing. And he published in that journal, there's his telescope. Okay, and my point there is, you see, it's a great club to be part of. You too can be publishing, doing research with people who are, part of this club that includes Isaac Newton, and all the scientists you've ever heard of. So please make sure that you finish the job and try and publish if you can. Okay, I believe my time is up. So, yes, you can be excused if your brain is full, or I'm going to stick around and be available for I'm here as long as you want me to be, and we're happy to talk to individuals about their work. And I will sign off with UC Merced colours. The UC colours are always some colour blue and some colour gold, in this case photographed in a piece of hippopotamus sweat under a microscope. Good luck to you all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Viney. We learned a lot. Did you all learn a lot today? Thank you very much on behalf of everyone.